Lovely. So again, thank you everyone and welcome to the event. And thanks for joining us today on International Men's Day for 2021. And, International Men's Day is all about acknowledging men in the workplace as role models and in life and society more broadly. And we at CIPD wanted to actually hold this event today to acknowledge the importance of that day and the conversations that we want to include and encourage men to be part of. And so when we think about International Men's Day, why are we actually doing this? Well, it sits within November. And it was really interesting on social media this morning because I've been posting about it. And a couple of people actually said to me they didn't know that International Men's Day existed, which is interesting because it was actually established back in 1999. But as I say, it sits within November. And so I think perhaps November it might be slightly higher, more profile. But as I say, the purpose of today is really about that piece on highlighting and focusing on men and positive role models, and also taking the opportunity to raise greater awareness about men's well-being in the round and in terms of their health. So, as I've said, we've decided to open up this conversation and hold the session today to really start to understand and examine, even if you like, the impact of challenges for men in the workplace. And what I would say is that those challenges can be any type or any source. They might not be what we would call or might perceive to be the obvious challenges. And we also wanted to talk today, take some time with you to explore how as employers and actually even as humans and individuals, we can better support men both at work but also more broadly. And then wrapped around all of that is the importance of building trust and connection. So understanding these challenges that men face, and if we think particularly about health and well-being, it's always been important. But with the last 20 months and the changes that we've seen in the relationship, the employee-employer relationship, we at CIPD Ireland and our panelists today, and many of you I know, which is why you've joined us today, think it's even more important now that we keep these conversations going. And in fact, for some, it might be that it's at the start of the conversations. And why is that so important? Well, I have some fairly stark statistics. Globally, for example, we know that one man takes his own life every minute of every day. We also know that more than 1.3 men globally are diagnosed with prostate cancer each year, and it's the second most common cancer in men. And when we think specifically about Ireland, we know that testicular cancer is the most commonly diagnosed cancer in young men in Ireland. And that while survival rates are greater than 95%, we also know that for some men, their quality of life can be significantly impacted as a result of the side effects of long-term treatment. So that gives you some sense of why we felt today was important, because we want to be able to think about how that could affect men and how some of the things and that impact they might bring into the workplace, and as I say, how we can support them. So I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by our two speakers today, our panel. We have Barry Holmes, and Barry comes with a very distinguished career in HR and is currently Director of HR, the RCSI University of Medicine and Health Sciences. And we have Breffney McGuinness, National Bereavement Development Specialist for Workplaces with Irish Hospice Foundation. And Breffney's work provides support, education and training in workplace grief situations across a broad range of sectors. But for now, I'm going to hand over to our speakers, and I'm going to ask our speakers to really provide an overview of themselves and their work and what their organizations do in terms of supporting their employees and the importance of well-being generally. So Barry, could I kick off with you?
Sure, great. Thanks, Jane, and thanks to yourself and Mary and the team for inviting myself and Breffney here today. We're delighted to be here. So just in terms, I suppose, to give you a bit of background on where I'm at, I'm obviously, as you said, the Director of HR in the RCSI. RCSI itself has been around since 1784. As the old lad is for more years than I care to remember. So our focus as a university is both on the postgraduate and the undergraduate side, but it's exclusively focused on health sciences. So we have undergraduate and graduate entry programs for medicine, for physio, for pharmacy. We have a new program starting in September of next year on advanced therapeutics as well, so for pharma, for the pharma industry. And we've a whole breadth of activities on the postgraduate side and CPD side as well. I suppose when I think about the topic for today, I suppose well-being itself, you said this yourself, Jane, in your introduction, has taken on a whole new meaning in the context of COVID, and how it sort of disrupted every aspect of our personal and professional lives in a way we could never have anticipated. And I think as an organization, and probably all of our organizations, the values that we often talk about are really tested when the chips are down and times are tough. And the more so for us in RCSI, our values are around respect, collaboration, relationships, and meaning. And so, you can see the extent to which those would have resonance in the times we've lived through. I think all organizations and all individuals have been on their own journeys over the past 2 years or so, but I think we could never have anticipated the sort of rapid acceleration that we've seen over the past 2 years as it relates to the topic that we're going to talk about today. So, as an organization, we have, I suppose, like many organizations, have been on a journey in relation to our support for staff. But I think that sort of the lines that traditionally maybe were blurred around professional and personal have now become very stark, because people's work and personal lives are inextricably linked now based on where they're physically located. So we've been doing engaged in lots of activities with staff around physical health, around nutrition, around financial health, around mental health. But they've taken on a whole new meaning, I suppose, over the last 2 years. And I think, we'll certainly get into some of the detail on that as over the next 50 minutes or so. So maybe that's sort of an intro from me. I'll hand over to Breffney.
Great, Barry, thanks very much. And again, thanks to Mary and Jane and all the team here. And delighted to be here today, and thank you for the invitation. And I suppose it's lovely to have an opportunity to speak as a man about men's issues and what it's like being a man working today. I know I think that's a very welcome development. I work in the Irish Hospice Foundation. I work in the area of bereavement support, particularly in the area of workplaces. And the Irish Hospice Foundation is a charity, and our brief is to provide and support the best end-of-life care and bereavement care for people, no matter what situation they find themselves in. And that applies particularly in the workplace. And I suppose the reality is, as Barry has mentioned, over the last 20 months, the whole reality of death, unfortunately, has become front and center in our lives. And as Barry also mentioned, the blur between personal and professional life has also dissolved quite significantly. So a lot of what the Irish Hospice Foundation does is try to support people to have the best end of life care when unfortunately people do become ill through cancer or through other illnesses. Those moments towards the end of people's lives are precious and very important. And our brief is to try and facilitate the best experience of that people can have. It's not something we would wish for anyone. It's not something we'd wish for ourselves. But when the reality happens, there are things that we can do that can make it better and make a difficult situation better. And that's really what we're about. And that extends into bereavement, which is my area, because a lot of the support for people that is required happens after somebody dies, and the period up to the death of somebody is really important, and we need to do all we can around that. But then we have a lot of people who are left behind grieving their loved one. And interestingly, if end-of-life care is done well, that actually helps people to grieve well afterwards. So it's another reason for putting our thoughts and energies into what we can do well when somebody is terminally ill. And then also, what can we do afterwards to support people? And that is particularly important around different kinds of losses that people can experience. It can be through death, but it can also be through other losses that we experience in our lives. So, for example, in workplaces, you're likely to experience people who have relationship breakups, sometimes marriage breakup, other losses that they may experience in their lives, which are not death per se, but can still impact on staff in the workplace.
Yeah.
And so it's really important to be aware of that and to have a sensitivity to that and a structure for responding to that. And that's a large part of the work that I do.
Mm-hmm.
I suppose some of the good things that have happened during COVID is a more openness in workplaces about responding to bereavement and supporting their staff through bereavement. There's been some excellent examples in really tough situations. One organization had a young woman who was terminally ill with cancer and who died during COVID. But the way that organization supported her, and most importantly as well, her family and her colleagues afterwards, gives us great hope in terms of that there are things that we can do and that can make a big difference to people. So that's a summary, I suppose, of what we do and the work that I'm in.
Yeah. It's I mean, that's so powerful, and it is very difficult sometimes.
So back to you, Jane. Thanks.
Oh, sorry, you froze. That's the joy of a live event, isn't it? It is so powerful, though, isn't it? What you've just been saying, and we met before today, obviously, to talk about the session and what have you. And I said very openly in that session when we met that, you know, one of my biggest concerns is all of that openness that came through and the change in the relationship between the employer and the employee as a result of the pandemic. You know, one of my biggest concerns is that will slip, and that we will perhaps go back to not necessarily completely the way it used to be, but it's that piece about, you know, how can we get people to connect and trust the organization with their personal stories. And Breffney, I know we're going to come on to talk about sort of like some of what you've just been talking about with, you know, the differences, the different types and sources of loss for people in the workplace and how different people react to those, which was quite shocking for me whenever we had that discussion, because I learned a lot about myself whenever we did. But before we get to that, could I ask each of you as individuals and as, you know, as men and as professional men, you know, why do you think days like today and, you know, International Men's Day and November and any other activity around it, why do you think it is so important in today's world of work? You're on mute, Barry.
It had to happen. Sadly, it did,
didn't it?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I mean, it was interesting. I told my wife and my daughter that I was talking at an International Men's Day event today, and they both said instantaneously, "Sure, every day is International Men's Day in our house." But seriously, I suppose, you know, I think we all kind of acknowledge that the future of work that we've talked about for a number of years before COVID is here. It's here now. We're living through it. And, you know, we've talked in the introductory comments about the decoupling of professional and personal barriers that maybe exist. I think days like this are important. I think it's a reminder for us to talk about these issues. I think as HR leaders, if we're talking about them, I think it gives a level of permission, if that's not too strong a word, kind of normalizes it and makes it part of the conversation as distinct from something that has to be only spoken about at particular times. I think it probably reflects, as I would sort of see it, an increased level of democratization of the workforce. We're seeing much more individualization and a much stronger focus on the person. And I think at various stages, certainly in our organization over the last year and a half, 2 years, we've seen that vulnerability, leaders talking about their own struggles and challenges that they faced. And I think that normalization of whatever aspect of life COVID has thrown at them has created that context for conversations to take place that maybe heretofore might have been taboo. You know, I think there's been a lot of visible sort of gender equality initiatives. And I say this kind of as a man, because I know men have talked about this in the workplace. You know, there's 30% clubs, International Women's Day, Athena Swan we have in higher education, Aurora, which is another women's only program. They're really important programs for women, but it's really important that men don't feel not part of that, and it's good to have male specific initiatives too, as important as the female ones are, and kind of okay to say it's okay for us to talk about men's specific issues. And I suppose the last thing I sort of just mention is I think it's good to help promote a focus in a positive way on male health specific issues. So, you know, my own father's generation, for example, you know, that sort of traditional male masculine culture has been stigmatized. So, you know, things like you'd see the lads down at the golf club talking about getting the prostate checked, you know, that became sort of a bit more normal. Now we're seeing women play golf, and we're seeing men and women talk about prostate in men, you know. Testicular cancer, as you said yourself, Jane, that was an area that, you know, men just didn't really have the knowledge about, didn't talk about it. And now that's being talked about more, and men are, you know, talking about checking themselves in the same way as women would check themselves in relation to breast cancer. And also I think male suicide, you know, that's something that has been kind of not really talked about that much, and that's being talked about more. And just, I suppose the last thing I would mention is I was actually watching a program last night. I don't know whether people saw it, just on eating disorders for men. It was a program on prime time. And again, you know, this guy talked very bravely about, you know, he was a 75 kg, 6'2" GAA player who, you know, everyone would think, well, that guy wouldn't have an eating disorder. And he did. And heretofore, eating disorders were something that you thought was the preserve of teenage girls, whereas actually it's something that affects all of us. So I think normalizing all of those issues that maybe traditionally had been taboo or not talked about or stigmatized or stereotyped for male or female, I think it's really healthy for us as a HR group and also a wider leadership within our organizations to be talking about these issues.
So thank you, Barry.
Yeah, and I think I'd agree with a lot of that. I think that what a day like today does is allow us to reflect, so men to reflect on their issues, and in an equal way, not one better than the other, or one worse than the other, but in a nice, balanced, equal way as women do. And that's right as well, that women should have the forums as well to reflect on women's issues. So I think it's good that way. And likewise, I got a similar reaction from my partner when I told her that I was doing a talk on International Men's Day. There was a face, and it was kind of like, well, every day is Men's Day, so like, what's your problem? But I still think that it's really, really valuable to do. And that normalization that Barry is talking about, that is really, really important. And it takes a bit of courage to open up, to say, actually, I'm struggling with my mental health. I had a friend of mine who I linked up with recently. I hadn't seen him for a couple of years, and we've been great pals when we were younger. And he told me that he had been struggling with depression and mental health for over 10 years. I never knew it. And it took a huge amount for him to actually admit that to me. But there's something liberating about doing that. There's something that gives permission to others to do that. And I think that's some of what we're looking at in the workplace, is creating that atmosphere. And it comes from all of us taking the lead and being open and saying, well, actually, I'm struggling a bit today, or whatever, or I'm finding it hard. And I think the points that Barry made about leaders, again, being open around how COVID has been stressing for them. The reality is COVID has been tough for everyone. It's been particularly tough for some people. And yet it's a shared reality that we're all experiencing and still living in and still dealing with. In terms of grief, certainly for men, one of the things that can be really helpful is, again, just being able to admit that I'm finding it tough, or I miss this person. And it could be a colleague at work, it could be a friend, it could be somebody close to us who has died, or as I say, it may be a non-death loss. But ability in the workplace to have a supportive atmosphere where it's okay to acknowledge that today I'm finding it a bit tough or things are a bit hard. That's how it is today. Doesn't mean it's going to be that way tomorrow. But what does make a difference is where the workplace atmosphere is supportive around that.
Yeah.
And we need a workplace atmosphere which allows the task to get done. That's why we're in work. It's not that we don't do that, but also when we're grieving that we can do that, but also focus on our loss as well. And that's really important. And that takes a bit of courage, and it's a bit of a risk. And we are also dealing with, again, maybe expectations of how men should be around grief. If we just take the example, let's say, of a stillbirth or a miscarriage, oftentimes with a stillbirth or a miscarriage, people will ask, how is your wife, how's your partner? And they won't ask the guy how he's doing.
Yeah.
And a midwife said this to me in her work over 20 years in a maternity hospital. The ones that she was really concerned for were the men, because they often get forgotten around these kind of losses.
Yeah.
So creating that atmosphere where it's okay to acknowledge a loss that I have had, to validate the feelings that I have around that, whatever they may be, and then to support. And the support can maybe just simply being there with somebody, maybe going for a coffee with them, or just saying, look, if you want to chat about that, that's okay.
Yeah.
And we also do that by the leadership we take ourselves, which is by taking the risk ourselves to open up around those kind of issues.
Can I just make one point,
yes,
Jane?
Yes, please do, Barry. Yes.
Based on what Breffney has said, because he does this really well and naturally. I think where someone opens up to you and has the courage to open up to you, it's also really important to be thoughtful about how you receive it, because it might come at you at a time when you're not expecting it, but it's right for that person. And I've had to sort of change my own behavior to make sure I just have the antenna up much more so over the last period, whereby, you're tipping along, working away, but actually someone might come at you at a time when you least expect it to open up. And you have to receive that in a way that makes them feel that you've heard them, as opposed to maybe my default might not have been that way. And I think it's a really subtle point, but I think it's a really important point, because it's not like something that's planned or ordered. It's something that may just emerge based on the particular set of circumstances. So it's just
absolutely, Barry. And I think what's even slightly, is it more nuanced than that? Is that it may be that it comes at an unexpected time, which isn't a good time for you either, but it may also come from an unexpected source. It might come from men who you would never think would want to have that sort of discussion, but they've got to that point for whatever reason. They've got, whatever the source of the challenge is, whether it's health, whether it's, life circumstances, events, or whatever. And I mean, that was kind of as we were talking. So I know we're going to talk about leadership a little bit more in a minute or two. But, how do we, as employers, and Breffney, you might have sort of some real advice on this as well as you, Barry, but as employers, how do we support our managers with dealing with this? The people who are, if you like, on the ground on a day-to-day basis, they're the ones that are in the middle. They've got to support their people. They've got to be able to deliver, but at the same time they themselves are people. So what do we do around that? Because it isn't just around this conversation that we have to support managers, but any ideas, any thoughts on that? And I've got a question that's coming through from the chat box as well, so we'll come to that in a minute as well. But if we could just take the piece around managers first, that'd be fabulous.
Sure. I suppose this goes back to the ethos of the organization, and that care has to be, I suppose, shown towards managers first, I would think. We have a saying in bereavement care: we've no right to offer care to others if we can't care for ourselves, first of all. And it is that bit we do need to care for our managers. Just to give you an example, we did some work with a university, again, during COVID, who had a lot of staff who were bereaved during COVID. And it was a 4-session intervention, which comprised about 6 contact hours in total. One of the staff, in reflecting on what that meant to her mum had died during COVID, she said, I've worked in this organization for over 20 years. I felt closest to this organization after that 6 hours. And she
Right.
said, this 6 hours allowed me to function and to do my work. It showed me that the organization cared for me. And she's a manager. And it was the fact that at a very low and vulnerable point in her life, the organization put something in place with other colleagues which was supportive to her. And so again, I suppose Barry alluded to this earlier as well. This is where the kind of rubber hits the road. It's when things get really rough, that's when people will know what kind of support is there. And I think I can speak from bereavement and death. That is a key time for staff in an organization.
Yeah.
Staff will watch how somebody is looked after when they're bereaved.
Yeah.
And the wonderful thing is, if it's handled well, people will walk through walls for you.
Yeah.
So it's that bit of looking at a very vulnerable time in people's lives. It's so important to respond with compassion, with humanity, and obviously to have structures in place. I'm talking here about bereavement. It would apply in other areas as well. But that means for staff well-being, what are we doing around bereavement and raising awareness among our staff of how loss impacts on people, how different people grieve in different ways? Can we help staff in raising awareness around that, as we would with other areas of staff well-being, healthy eating, all of this kind of stuff? Can we do that? For our managers, can we help and support them by giving them the skills to be able to respond to staff within their organization who are bereaved? And, you know, the really interesting thing about this, it's not huge amounts of work that is involved in this. In relation to bereavement, what makes a huge difference to a staff member is how they are treated by their manager. And it's usually the line manager that will be key. And, you know, Barry's touched on some of this about the modeling of behaviors, the modeling of approaches. It's okay to say as well as a manager, I don't know how best to support you. Can you tell me how I can do that?
Yeah.
And so what we're doing is we're acknowledging, look, I'm not an expert in this, and it mightn't be your area. Some of us are good in relating to people. Other people, that's really difficult, but we're very good at other things. You don't have to be an expert in everything, but what you can do are the basic pieces. And that is where you can say, look, how best can I support you today? Here's what we have in place in our organization. Is there other things that I can do for you? Please come back to me over time. You may not be able to think of everything today. Please come back to me over time and we can chat through. And I'm open, a bit like, you know, Barry's saying there, you're open around, well, okay, I don't know all about this or that, but please tell me. And I want, and I will commit to you that I will respond to you with compassion, with openness, and I will action it, you know. So that's what our managers can do. And we need to support our managers to be able to do that. And that's giving them the confidence to be able to respond in that way.
Absolutely. And that comes back to that piece about not just building, and I say just building, but that comes back to that whole conversation about trust, doesn't it? That the manager knows that they can trust the organization to support them in those sorts of conversations in the way that their member of staff can trust them to help them as well. Barry, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I mean, Breffney's covered it much more eloquently than me. I mean, just two things, just personal sort of experience is kind of, I suppose, really becoming more confident talking about things. So I mean, and this is just two examples for me, and I'm far from the paragon of virtue on this, and I don't get it right all the time, and you have to be prepared to sometimes get it wrong. But I think I think the way Breffney has described, if you're not comfortable as a manager giving the support to say, I know you're upset in relation to this, but I actually don't know exactly how best to help you. Can you tell me what are the kinds of things you'd like me to do? I think that's a really supportive way to acknowledge if you don't have the comfort of the skill. So I think that's brilliant. That's a great sort of mantra. But I think two things for me just kind of struck me, and they were kind of things that weren't really spoken about. That in my own life, before we had our first daughter 18 years ago, my wife had a miscarriage and nobody was talking about it. Nobody was talking about it in society. And as I talked to people, both in work and outside of work about it, the degree to which it was so prevalent astounded me. And actually talking about it with a couple of other people that had lost children through miscarriage, it was really, really comforting for me. So that was just sort of one thing. And now, I'm just much more in tune with it, having talked about it. And I suppose the second one for me, which I think is really important, is just around sort of coping with death and bereavement. And Breffney spoke about this in the pre-session, and this was just my own experience very quickly in relation to my uncle, who I was quite close to. It was the first time I had been to Mount Jerome for a cremation. I had always been to funerals where the coffin went into the ground when somebody died. And this was a cremation where, I don't know if people have been at cremations, where the curtains close very slowly. And Perry Como and I Love You So was playing, which was a song my own dad sung. And I was there with the children and I bawled, absolutely bawled, to the point where my mother said to me, "Is Barry okay?" Because and it was just, I couldn't explain my reaction. And I've actually talked to people about that. And actually we had a girl in work whose father passed away only a couple of weeks ago. And we were there, and I actually it enabled me to be prepared for it, because I had no context for that before. And I suppose it's trying to break down some of the stigma maybe that's there around men. I think women are much better in terms of talking about these things and socializing these things. And it's to try and, I suppose, give men the confidence that they can talk about these things. And what's interesting now with my own children is they now know about cremations. And they now are saying to me, "Dad, you're not going to get cremated, are you? Because please, I wouldn't want your ashes on the counter at home, because I'd be afraid I'd knock them over." So we've kind of normalized that conversation in our own family. But had that not have happened, and had we not have talked about it, it would never have occurred. So I kind of feel that bit of vulnerability that we have to be. Not that I'm not saying my way was the right way, but it was the way I experienced it. And actually talking about it certainly was helpful to me. I don't know if it's been helpful to others, but people have said to me, the fact that you've talked about it now means, it's created a kind of a normality where heretofore maybe it wouldn't have been something they would have been comfortable talking about.
No, absolutely, Barry. And I'm just thinking as well, we launched a guide last week on responding to suicide in the workplace. And I've had exactly the same experience that you've had. From that, I've just been so blown away by how many people have come up and said, "Well, do you know, I was in another organization and one of our senior managers died by suicide." Or my friend was in a company and they had somebody who died by suicide. And something which we think is there's not that much of it out there, actually there is, and the experiences that people have. And it's by being able to open up. These are difficult conversations. The reality is, as you said, Barry, sometimes we might get very upset and that can be awkward. We might feel awkward and uncomfortable. It's not that we're not going to feel that, but it's acknowledging that that is what we feel. Yes, I feel awkward. Yes, I feel uncomfortable. But you know what? I can still kind of talk about this, or I can still be with the person. And I think, again, in workplaces, being able to acknowledge that I am likely to feel awkward and uncomfortable around people who have died or who have had significant losses, but not to let that stop me from reaching out. And sometimes we have to be a bit courageous around the uncomfortableness and step over that to get somewhere further and to maybe break a bit of new ground for people. And it does take a bit of courage, and it does take a bit of allowing ourselves to be vulnerable. But that gives huge permission to others to do the same. And that's part of the way that we build the fabric of a culture in a workplace.
As you said to me, Breffney, before, I mean, I think, which was a great takeaway for me, is, there's no playbook for bereavement. No. And even sort of saying that gives people that permission that you talk about.
Absolutely. And I was in touch with an organization recently, and one person, their mother had died during COVID. And this person, very proactive, a manager in the organization, she was shocked by the absence of recognition from the organization of her mother's death. And she was turning it into a positive in the sense that she wanted and was making this her mission to make sure that that experience wasn't something that other people in the organization would have. Now, it mightn't have been done deliberately. It may have been just an oversight or whatever, but you said, I felt like I was a suitcase on the side of the road because nobody acknowledged what happened and nobody contacted me about it. And that's very powerful. That's that bit where we realize in those really vulnerable moments, somebody reaching out and taking the initiative, yes, it may be awkward, but the difference it makes to the person. The wonderful thing for that organization is that she's still committed to the organization and wants to do something about it and wants to change it. But it is that bit of, there is risk involved. We have to be courageous. Sometimes it won't go right. And you're right, Barry, in saying this, like none of us are perfect at this. Sometimes we'll get it wrong. And my question there would be, so what? If we get it wrong, at least somebody will know that they mattered enough. They had the intent to try and reach out to me. That's the bit that makes the difference. That's the bit, hopefully from COVID, we're able to learn. We need to be a little more brave, a little more courageous around reaching out to people who have been bereaved. Yes, we may get it wrong. The timing might be great. We may feel awkward. They may feel awkward, but I can guarantee you somebody will really appreciate the fact that you've made the effort to reach out to them, particularly around a bereavement.
So just on that, about COVID itself, we've had a question asked about, do you think that the COVID pandemic has focused more on women and mothers rather than men and fathers?
Oh, that's an interesting one. I think there probably has been quite a lot of focus on women and mothers. I don't know that it's one or the other. One thing we have to keep in mind is that we don't all grieve the same way. And some people want to talk about their loss and are open, and that's how they cope.
Yeah.
And other people are more private, and they still feel their grief, they still process their grief, but they do it in a different way. And it's not in an open way. They might be more solitary in how they cope with their grief. And that's often associated with men. We call it an instrumental style of grieving. In other words, you're an instrument in the world. So you go do things. And so if I experience a loss, let's say my mum dies, if I'm an instrumental griever, the way that I grieve is I go do things. I don't want to talk to other people about it. I don't want to sit in a group with others about the bereavement. I don't want somebody coming up to me all the time asking me about it. But I may want somebody coming up to me from time to time, checking in with me, and I will manage that myself, and I will process my grief through doing things. That's generally associated with men, and that's what we call an instrumental style. And then there's another style, which is an intuitive style of grieving, and that's where I process my grief by openly talking about my emotions, and by seeking out others and having others around me to talk, to cry, to express my emotions. That's what we call intuitive grieving. That's generally associated with women. And interestingly, in the bereavement world, and there is such a world, unfortunately, but we tend to favor intuitive grievers. We build a lot of our supports around intuitive grievers. And maybe that's why today is really good. We need also to look at building supports for instrumental grievers. And that means adjusting and supporting men in the way, if it's men, if you're a male instrumental griever, in the way that's going to be helpful for you. A lot of that is around task. So an instrumental griever will be more comfortable engaging in a task around their grief. That might be doing a book of remembrance. It might be setting up a charity. It might be doing a fundraiser. It's task-based. And they won't necessarily talk about their grief, but they're doing or processing their grief through the action. Whereas
this can apply to, sorry, Bethany, to interrupt, but this can also apply to other types of challenge, can't it? Absolutely. So it's not just about bereavement, because when we've discussed this before, and this is what I mentioned earlier, I was quite shocked that you've just described an instrumental griever, someone. I've always thought of myself as being the intuitive type. I'm not. What you've described is, I shared this with both of you when we spoke before. And obviously, I'm a woman, but when I lost my mother very suddenly in 2013, and when I've lost other people in my life as well, and they've died, I automatically have always said I go into change project manager mode because I have to do things. And I find the same thing in a work sense that, if something goes wrong, or, I have lost a job in the past, and So those things can apply in the same way, can't they, Breffney?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And the interesting thing, Jane, and thanks for being so honest about sharing that. The interesting thing there is there's a societal expectation of women to grieve in a certain way. And there's a societal expectation on men to grieve in a certain way. It's changing. That expectation is fluid and it does change. But there are still pretty key things that we expect of the genders in terms of grief. The real challenge is if your style doesn't fit the societal expectation of how you should grieve. And this is going to happen in workplaces. So how do we support people around that? Like the simple approach is you build on the person's normal way of coping. So as a HR manager or as another manager, we check with the person, again, how do you cope with things normally? How can I support you best? So again, I go back to that piece of how can I support you best? And you allow the person who's grieving to tell you about what would help them. And we can sometimes be surprised by what comes back. You know, it might be, today I don't want to talk about the grief, but you know what I would like? Let's talk about the rugby on Sunday, please. Because all I want right now is to get a break from that. And that's actually a healthy part of grieving. We can't spend all the time focusing on what is lost. We need to move backwards and forwards between who we have lost and our feelings around that and what we're experiencing now and adjusting to our life now. So again, in workplaces, it's informing managers. How can we help managers to say that, look, I don't have to treat everybody exactly the same around this. It's very difficult anyway. And there are different styles, and what might work for one person won't necessarily work for somebody else. This is also helpful if, unfortunately, you're in a workplace and you're responding maybe to a staff member who has died or a very difficult situation. Again, getting everybody together and expecting everybody to talk about their feelings may not work because people have different styles. So it's thinking that bit through as well. And again, checking with people, what would be helpful, what works for you. But this absolutely does come not just from loss, but it's other aspects of our lives as well. And one of the things that we would talk about, a really interesting aspect of grief, is what we call disenfranchised grief or hidden grief. And that's where if I experience a loss that goes against the norms of my society or my social grouping. So look, we can think, if you think, for example, of abortion or something like that, it's maybe, it goes against a little bit of the norms of society. We can think of suicide as well, even though that's changing. And what happens there is my grouping, my social grouping may withhold support for me because the loss is kind of goes against what our social grouping holds as valuable. That's a really key thing to be aware of in the workplace as well. Because again, you're going to have staff who are dealing with losses that may not be quite that easy. And again, from an employer point of view, it's providing that consistent support and that consistent supportive atmosphere for staff around the loss, whatever the loss is.
Fantastic. Thank you, Breffney. So Barry, could I just follow on slightly with that with you? In terms of resistance to these types of conversations in the workplace, because I've worked in and around leading inclusion and diversity for years, and I've seen every type of resistance there could be to all of these conversations, which is why these days are so important. And not just these days, but that we carry the conversation throughout the year. But, as a leader in this field and in the HR sector, what would be your advice to anyone listening today, or even, catching up afterwards with the event? And maybe what have, the RCSI, for example, put in place to help get over those types of resistance?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think the two sort of key themes from what Breffney has talked about, which resonate with me in relation to your question, are around sincerity and authenticity. So you have to be sincere and you have to be authentic, I think, as a leader. And there's the old adage of if you can't see it, you can't be it. So, I think if senior people in the organization are not genuine, sincere, and authentic, it's going to ring very hollow. Those conversations are going to ring very hollow. So from an RCSI perspective, I suppose we've looked at it from a couple of different dimensions. the first is we kind of had a spotlight on well-being series, which we ran, which kind of where it was basically either a video or a short text, which senior leaders shared, the senior team shared around what was working well and what wasn't working well from their perspective through COVID. And that was a bit of risk and a bit of courage associated with that. Some were more risky and some were more courageous than others, but it's down to people to share what they feel comfortable sharing. And so I think that was important. We teach our students about growth mindsets and not fixed mindsets. And we've, embraced that ourselves through work we've been doing around trying to create what we call a positive organization, which sounds a bit trite, but there's a science behind it. Which is focusing on climate, the climate within the organization, the communications processes that are in place, the relationships that are in place, and meaning. So message and meaning. And that's really important. I think we've very intentionally in certain areas of the organization, which would have been traditionally the preserve of women, we've encouraged men to get involved. So for example, Parents and Carers Network, right, which would have been traditionally female only forum, we've encouraged men to get involved, and they have got involved. But we're on a journey on that, not perfectly formed, but we have people talking about not just kids that they're looking after, but a lot of people, as we all age, are looking after older family and relatives. And that brings a very different set of challenges to younger children. The one that's been most interesting from our point of view is we had a hugely high uptake on work that we've done in terms of including pronouns in our email signatures. Yes. Really amazed by the extent to which we would have thought there would have been huge resistance to that. People have just embraced it. And that's been really encouraging to see that. And I suppose people might traditionally have thought RCSI was quite a conservative culture, but it's interesting when you try things and, with the possibility that they may not land very well, you actually can be surprised at the outcome, that there was actually very few detractors in relation to things that we have tried. Like we've talked about this concept of fail fast. I always say to myself, when's the last time I failed fast? It's a great question to ask yourself. And I think in relation to this agenda, I think you have to be confident to maybe go places that you didn't go before, if you believe it's in the best interest of the organization. But it's different leaders will go at different paces in relation to that. But I think it's that point that we made at the start around that vulnerability, that you have to feel confident and will feel supported when you put yourself out there, that it will be received in a very positive way. And I think 99 times out of 100, that'll be the way people receive you, because they will have been impacted in a similar way.
Fantastic, thank you. Breffney, did you want to come in on that one?
Yeah, I'm just thinking that the resistance is going to be there if it's something new or strange that we're not used to, and we have all of our fears around that. But it is that piece of sometimes taking the risk and acknowledging that fear is there, but also trying things. And I think Barry has given very good examples of that, of the trying stuff. We did research in 2018, December 2018, on employees, and we asked them, what was the thing you wanted most from your employer when you were bereaved? And we were really surprised at what came back. The highest thing that people wanted, 75% of people wanted to be treated with compassion. And that was above leave policies and stuff like that, and flexibility, which were there as well. But what it said is, when you are at a low point or a difficult point or a challenging point in your life, what you want from your employer is compassion. And that can mean a lot of different things to different people. But I think what it means is being human and being authentic in our engagement with people, being open to the fact that we may not have all the answers, but we do commit to taking the initiative to reach out to people, to engage, to be willing to learn, and to support people at a vulnerable time in their life. Yeah. And that's, I think, really important across the board for bereavement. It's really important for men as well, to support men around their grief. And interesting, I do a lot of drama in my personal life, not so much in the last 20 months, but I'm a big fan of Shakespeare. And Shakespeare knows about grief. His son Hamlet died aged 11, and he didn't handle his death very well. But he wrote a number of plays afterwards, one of which was Hamlet. But in one of his plays, Macbeth, he talks about male grief, and he says, "Give sorrow words, the grief that doesn't speak, whispers the o'er-fraught heart and bids it break." And as a man writing at the end of the 16th century, he's writing about the importance of a man to express his grief and for others to witness and acknowledge that grief. And I think it's a really helpful thing for us to think about the piece about grief. If we keep it to ourselves, if we don't talk about it, it can fester, it can break our hearts. In workplaces, can we create workplaces which are supportive of that, which take the risk to allow men to be able to find a comfort and a safe space in work, which will allow them not to fix their grief, not to make everything better, but to acknowledge what it is that they're experiencing, whatever the cause of that loss, whether it's a death, whether it's a relationship breakup, whether it's another thing that's causing a stress in their lives. And we know from mental health awareness that where we can speak about our problems, where we can feel that we're supported in some way, that makes a huge difference. So I think things like that could be really helpful for us. And again, maybe taking that risk, there is a risk involved, but you know, there's a value in taking a risk as well. There is that growth that Barry has talked about. And I suppose what COVID hopefully has shown us is that maybe the things that we valued before, or maybe didn't value that much, such as our shopkeepers, our nurses, our healthcare workers, our postmen, but there is a value in being able to be supported by our neighbours, by our colleagues, and that makes a difference to the quality of life that we have. And that will mean that I'll be able to contribute to my organisation, excuse me, from a good place.
Fantastic, which leads me on beautifully to my final question. And don't forget, everyone, you can still ask questions. We've got a couple of minutes left. For both of you, what would be, and I'm going to say the top two things you would ask employers to think about in how they could maybe better support men in their organizations? We've talked a lot about, you know, building trust, understanding that people are different, people will react and respond in different ways to, you know, whatever that challenge is in the workplace. But is there anything more that you think the employers can think about in how they can better support men?
I think if we're talking about grief and bereavement and end of life care, it's please open the conversation with men around this, whether it's the man who is dealing with a cancer diagnosis or some other illness that's there, or whatever may be going on in their lives. Please open that conversation, take the risk, reach out and be proactive around that. I think that would be one of the first things that I would ask. And my second thing would probably be, you know, to support managers to be able to do that and to be supported themselves in that.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and for me, Jane, I think, and we've talked about it, but I do think role modeling from the top by showing vulnerability, I think is really important. It's kind of agnostic of what the issue is, but just creating a tolerance and an acceptance within the organization of not knowing, and that normalizes what heretofore had not been, you know, it maybe hadn't been spoken about. I think that's really important. I think the other thing, and maybe this is a bit more sort of training focused, you know, I do think there is something around psychological safety. And there is probably some specific training. I know it's something that we're looking at. So there is a little bit of I think dedicated training that might be required. And again, it's to create that additional support for managers where they just, you know, it's getting comfortable with that vulnerability. How do they create those safe spaces within their teams to ensure that those conversations can be given the oxygen that they need? They would be the two for me that are really important.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. We're getting some really lovely comments in the chat box, which hopefully you can see as well, about really the power of what we've talked about today, and about your complete honesty, and thanking you for being so open. We haven't actually got any more questions, so we've actually run over. I thought we would probably finish around sort of 45, 50 minutes. So we've done fantastically well, and all it remains for me to say is thank you so much for not only helping us, with the webinar today, but again, for your honesty and your openness and, what can be very difficult conversations, really. And, I put on social media this morning that I was very pleased to be having a session with two brilliant men to talk about supporting men in the workplace today, and I stand by that. So thank you personally, but also thank you very much on behalf of CIPD Ireland. Enjoy the rugby, Barry, on Sunday. And Breffney, I don't know what you're doing with your weekend, but have a fantastic one, whatever it is, and the same to everyone else as well. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks very much, Jane. And
thank you, Jane.
To Barry as well, and CIPD. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.